It's Sciandra's Saturday Night Special. Tonight's guest, Nick Muldoon.
Hello there, and welcome to my Saturday Night Special. Tonight I'll be talking with film critic, podcast host, and DJ Nick Muldoon. We'll discuss the state of film distribution, coronavirus's impact on the arts, and a variety of other topics. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks. Welcome, Nick Muldoon. For those who don't know you, you are how would you put it? Would you say a film critic, DJ, I guess music blogger too?
I mean, all those things are accurate.
Podcast host. Probably foremost a DJ right now, since that's kind of what I actually do professionally. But yeah, I obviously do co-host the Cynicism podcast and run the website as well, cynicismfilm.com. But yeah, aside from that, a lot of my background too is in music journalism locally. So right now, when we talk about the Cynicism podcast, this is something that you do with Brian Johnson, local musician. You typically discuss more timely features as opposed to classics, which is nice. It is au courant in that way.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the recent spate of films that have come out have been higher quality than in years past, or?
So, I mean, it depends really when we're talking about. Obviously, 2020 has been rough because of coronavirus.
Right,
Not much has come out. And normally we are in what I like to call the dumping season anyway, which I traditionally typify as being from like January to March. And the reason for this is, like, for whatever reasons, films just don't tend to do as well at the box office during that time of year. So what you end up having is a lot of studios that have no idea when to release a movie and just kind of leave it on the shelf.
Yeah.
End up just dumping it anywhere between that January to March region there. So you get a lot of kind of middling afterthought type movies. You know, like we had earlier this year a section where there were about 8 horror movies released in a span of 6 weeks, and none of them were particularly good. There was like a remake of The Grudge, there was The Turning, there was Underwater, which was like an Alien ripoff.
With Kristen Stewart from Twilight, right?
Yeah, which, to be fair, I actually thought that was one of the better of the like dump movies, but it was pretty rough going. That being said, I thought 2019 was one of the like best film years in ages. Like I've rarely gone through a year where I thought there were so many like kind of like just top tier movies where, like, I think looking back, because I always see a lot of movies every year, there will be some years where I think you're lucky if you get like one movie that you can describe as like truly great, or 2 movies. And I think this year I saw maybe 5 or 6 movies that I would consider that.
That's interesting. So you think that maybe 2019 was a particularly high benchmark in this new millennium? Or maybe it's not a benchmark because you have really good years, like 2008 was a remarkable year for film. And for people who don't know, that was No Country for Old Men. That was There Will Be Blood.
That was actually 2007.
Oh, right. You're correct.
Yeah,
2008 award season. You're right.
Yeah. It kind of blurs together.
But 2008, I guess.
That had Wall-E and The Dark Knight, which that was pretty good as well. I do think you sometimes just randomly get years that are somewhat just everything like comes out at the right time, and you have a lot of top tier directors who release projects around then.
Yeah, like 1989 and 1999 were really interesting years for film.
Yeah, I think there's probably an argument to be made that 1999 might be one of the most important years in film.
Yeah, I've heard that. just because of, apart from just great movies, it's the range of projects you had and kind of the new sort of films you had. Like, I mean, even take something like Blair Witch Project. That was, it wasn't necessarily the first found footage movie, but it was like the first one to really popularize it. And it was the first.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. And it was the first film that kind of like premiered at Sundance and then went on to make like $100-200 million.
I was going to say, it was a box office phenomenon leveraged against a micro budget with no star power behind it. And it was really in the infancy of, not the infancy, but the nascent internet and virability and marketing. That was the first R-rated film I had seen in a theater, and I knew that it wasn't real because, you cannot show crimes.
Right. They'd be like, this is the highest grossing snuff film of all time.
Correct, yeah, it was. But I remember I knew it was fake, but it was like an amusement park ride. It was very thrilling and it was magical. It was transcendent in so far as you feel what they feel because it was kind of raw. But I don't want to go too far along before we just maybe set the stage or give a little bit of context for your interest in film. What was the genesis of that?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I guess it definitely started early. Like, I think anyone who gets really into film just has a sense, like, early on in their life that it kind of seems to mean a little bit more to them than it does other people. There's just a different kind of excitement around it. I remember even going back, like, as a kid, like, whenever birthdays or Christmas came up, I just always asked for VHS tapes, whether it was like Star Wars or I don't know. I had a weird obsession with Small Soldiers, the Joe Dante movie.
Yeah, with Tommy Lee Jones and
yes.
A young Kirsten Dunst. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, very.
I remember that.
And Phil Hartman was in it as well.
Oh, that was Joe Dante, huh?
Yeah, very, very meaningful film for 8-year-old Nick. But then I think what it was more, my family had a big interest in movies. My mom always would go maybe once a week to the movies. And because I kind of grew up with a single mom, it was kind of the thing of like, there's no sitter, so we're all going to just go see whatever movie I want to see. So we kind of got to pick every other week. But it also meant I was going to see a lot of movies my mom just wanted to see. Not necessarily super like inappropriate, but maybe like adult dramas that I wouldn't have like seeked out on my own.
Yeah, like
I remember,
one week you're seeing Small Soldiers, and then the next Regarding Henry, or So you begin to develop what would you call it, a vocabulary. You kind of understand that. Oh, all right. This is what this film is trying to accomplish versus what this film is trying to accomplish, that they're not necessarily always, yes, they should all be trying to entertain, but not necessarily cutting corners or line cutting, I would call it, to entertain. So for instance, your popcorn films might kind of shirk the responsibility for character development or world building or something like that. But if you're watching, let's say, a film noir or a or some sort of mystery, if you don't put these clues in place, it's not a worthwhile experience for the audience if they don't feel they can also attempt to solve the mystery. Is that close? Do you feel like you developed your tastes and your vocabulary in watching those films that as a child you didn't want to watch?
I think it was part of it. I think what it was to me was realizing it kind of strains off exactly what you're saying. It's that when you're a kid and you're watching family films, blockbusters, that kind of thing, you have a very specific sort of emotional response they want to make you feel. Just kind of exhilarate it. So once in a while, it'll have some layer of depth more to it than that, but it's entertainment first and foremost. And then you just realize you're feeling something different when you leave these films than maybe the movies I grew up on. And sometimes you don't even know that you can put like an exact word to the feeling that you're walking out the cinema with. So I think that was a lot of it. And then two really crucial moments for me were, like any kid in the 90s, I was just obsessed with Pokemon. So I used to watch like Saturday morning cartoons, and on WB right after Pokemon, for who knows what reason, they showed Siskel and Ebert. And
at the movies, that was like Saturday, and then after that, if I remember, it was like Fox Saturday afternoon at the movies, and it was usually they would just play something like the Pelican Brief or something from the early 90s or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, what it was there was one week where I was watching Pokemon, and then right after they had a review for the Pokemon movie. So I was just like, oh, it's more Pokemon TV. And then I got really excited about that until Gene Siskel just started hammering into how terrible the Pokemon movie was.
Yeah.
And I was like, these guys are jerks. I hate them. But then I was also just so excited that there was a TV show about movies that I was like, this is really cool. And I started watching it like every weekend. And it was just movies I'd want to see. And it became just like my regular Saturday. It was like, oh, okay, there's Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And then there's Siskel and Ebert. And that kind of helped me like choose what I wanted to see after like a year or two of that. So, for example, the first rated R movie I saw was, I feel like, kind of atypical, because like people in my class would be like sneaking in to see Scream 3, and mine was secretly ordering the Royal Tenenbaums on video on demand.
Yeah, that's interesting. That would have been 2001. Okay, so when you say the first R-rated film, I don't remember the first one I'd seen. It was probably like Terminator 2, at a friend's house or something. But no, I take your point. No, that's interesting. The Royal Tenenbaums, I'll just say quickly, is one of my favorite films. You have a magnificent cast, and it's a large cast, and no character is paid short shrift, and they all have a relationship that interacts with one another, and they all have these dynamics that just make it such a joy to watch. It's funny that that's your first R-rated film.
Yeah. And what I think about that too, when I think back on it, I think like there's so many ways that maybe the first R-rated movie I saw, if it was kind of in that sort of artsy sense, could have been like something that turned me off immediately. But I do think there is something about Wes Anderson's films where it's like, so much of the humor comes from like this childish pettiness between the characters that I think even at like 11, like I picked up on what that humor was already. I was like, I don't know if I've seen this before, but it's really funny.
There's petulance, and there's an inversion of dynamics that really shouldn't be there. I'm thinking specifically about Rushmore. You have, I think he was a steel magnate. Yeah. Herman Bloom, Bill Murray's character, is palling around with a prep school brat, and it shouldn't work, but you cannot. The magnetism is there. It's like this should probably be an inappropriate relationship, but part of me wants to watch this ad infinitum, and that was probably one of the first R-rated films that I think I would have rented from Blockbuster. And for some of the younger listeners, Blockbuster was a oh,
that hurt.
Now, with regard to renting movies versus just theaters, what do you have a preference?
So for me personally, it's not really even closer contest. I kind of need to see films in theaters. And for me, it's not necessarily even so much as like necessarily the big screen, or say things like in the case of something like Avatar, this kind of like transcendent experience. It's more just, I feel like when you go to a cinema, It's that you just have to focus on one thing. Like you are in a pitch dark room with this screen, this giant screen, being the center of your attention and nothing else. And sure, there can be distractions. We've all had some bad theater experiences, I'm guessing. But there is still kind of the sense that like, say you check your phone, say you start talking to people, that you are still kind of breaking some kind of social etiquette, that you're not supposed to be doing that. And you are kind of, I feel like, just truly sort of transported to that world for a while.
There's immersion that doesn't exist on your couch.
Exactly. And I've even, since the quarantine started, I've even found it kind of difficult at times, I mean in general, to watch movies at home without getting distracted. We talked sort of off mic a second ago about you being able to hear cars on my street, and that's exactly what happens when I'm watching a movie. I'll hear the garbage truck coming down the street picking up garbage for an hour, and then it's like can't focus on the movie. Or there'll be a text group that I'm in, and I'll turn my phone around for 30 seconds and see I got 40 texts, and I'm like, oh, I wonder what they're talking about. And I do think there is something to say about, like, obviously the movies that are blockbusters, it is a different experience seeing it on a big screen. It is kind of formatted and filmed to it be as big a spectacle as possible. But for even smaller movies, I almost find it a better experience because of it's almost like it's giving that story and those characters a larger platform that doesn't make it as easy to dismiss when I'm watching it from the comfort of my couch.
Sure.
Because I feel like sometimes I'll turn on, like, say it's a low budget comedy on Netflix or something, and I'll kind of watch it, and I can kind of see the budget restraints and kind of its limitations. And if I'm not really into it in the first 10 minutes, I'll be like, all right, I'll watch something else. But if I see it in a theater, maybe with having to be forced into that experience, having to sit through it, I'm just kind of like, you know what? I'm here. I bought my ticket. It's the only thing on in the theater right now. I'm going to give it the attention and time that it's asking for of me. And if I like it, I like it. If I don't, I don't. Either way, when I come out, I've got something to say about it.
Conversely, you're able to maybe see a sub-quality as far as plot is concerned, or pacing, or some other considerations in a horror film at home. But then when you see it in a big screen, in a large format, you can maybe appreciate the actual the cinematography, or you can appreciate the help me, what's the right word? Not framing, but ostensibly framing. The composition of shots is maybe you're able to do that in in a theater with sensory deprivation, insofar as all the lights are off, your eye is guided someplace, as opposed to you're in your living room, the lights are on, and
absolutely. Like, that's the thing. And for me especially, who really loves horror movies, I can watch them at home, but honestly, it's rare that I get scared watching a movie at home. Even maybe if it's like late by myself, I will, but it's just not going to be the same experience. When you have sort of that surround sound system around you that's in a theater, which is something you really can't recreate at home. I don't care if you have like 7.1 surround, like, it's not going to be the same as a theater setup.
Mm-hmm.
When you're just completely fully surrounded by the noise and immersed in it, a horror movie especially can manipulate you and play with you in a way that it can't when you watch it at home. Because of at the end of the day, if you get too creeped out during a horror movie, you can just press pause and be like, I'm going to text my friends until I'm feeling a little more chill.
Yeah.
Come back to it. When you see it in a theater, if it's really scaring you, you kind of just got to be like, all right, I'm just going with it. I'm going to see where this takes me.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm too scared, I just gotta leave. I got to do it. But I mean,
the price of entry is more such, and I don't necessarily just mean your ticket price when you go to see a movie in a theater and you and maybe you're overcome with emotion from something, but it's the decorum of getting up and leaving during a film. Do you think that maybe the way we consume a film is shot through an eyepiece, and unless and it's seen on a screen for dailies, and basically it is edited primarily on a television screen. So maybe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, do you think that there is maybe a lack of directors who still fully appreciate what's shown on the big screen, or do you think that maybe they pull their punches and opt for a small screen audience as opposed to a big screen audience, or maybe there's no significant difference with the level of definition cameras and such?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question, because that's something that I've talked about a couple times recently on our podcast, which is that I do think, by and large, if you polled most young filmmakers, even those who have sort of debuted within the last 10 years, I think 9 out of 10 of them would tell you they still absolutely want to see that movie on a big screen. That's how they viewed it. A lot of them, even, there's been a very huge sort of swing back to filming on 35 millimeter recently. In the early 2000s and the early part of this millennium, it was a lot of digital filmmaking, and it's a lot of the filmmakers who are in sort of their 20s and 30s who are pushing that right back to film, and they want to see those movies projected that way.
You mean like Paul Thomas Anderson and...
So I'm even thinking sort of younger than that. Someone like Greta Gerwig, like, she filmed Lady Bird digitally, but when she finally had the money from Lady Bird to film Little Women, she filmed on 35 millimeter. There's guys like the Safdie brothers who put out Uncut Gems last year. They're kind of seen as two of like the big, new, fresh, sort of exciting filmmakers. They've shot virtually everything they've done on 16 or 32 millimeter. Or I'm sorry, 35 millimeter. You have people like Ari Aster, who put out Midsommar and Hereditary. He's, again, one of these sort of new filmmakers who have debuted within the last 5-10 years. He shoots exclusively on film. And I follow a lot of these filmmakers, too, on social media, Twitter, Instagram, too. And some of them will even express like their kind of disappointment when they go see a movie and it's shot digitally. And I don't think it's meant to be sort of in a snobby way. I do think it's like an aesthetic thing. But that being said, I do think you're seeing things change in the film industry, not just necessarily visually, but in terms of actually how a film is constructed in general. And what I mean is, I do think there's almost like something that is like a Netflixification of cinema. And what I mean by this is, you'll have filmmakers like Martin Scorsese or Alfonso Cuarón, who have movies that premiere on Netflix, and they make them the same way they would anyway. But then you also have weekly movies that debut on Netflix. And I turn them on, and I almost sense like there's something about the way the film is constructed that it goes beyond just necessarily like lowest common denominator filmmaking. It almost seems like this sort of like ADD thing of like, how can we make sure we're capturing someone's attention every second so they're not looking away? Because if they know the experience of watching a film on Netflix is fundamentally different than watching it at home or in a theater. So they just simply want to capture your attention. Not necessarily a film, but you look at the phenomenon of something like Tiger King like this. Like, this is something where it's just like a bizarre, weird story with an insane twist or turn every 15 minutes because they don't want you to look away. They just want you to keep consuming more content. And when you look at films, like there's a movie called something Wedding Repeat that just came on. I watched like 20 minutes of that the other day. It seemed like there was like some big comedic set piece every 15 seconds. There was that Mark Wahlberg movie, Spencer Confidential, that recently premiered. And that literally was just like it had like a new storyline or a new kind of like supporting character who was like a big cameo every 15 minutes, and I'm just like, what am I watching? This feels like if Saturday Night Live was like an action movie.
Well, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about is, do you ever get the suspicion that there's some meta manipulation with the way we are viewing our content or consuming it? And what I mean to say is, and this goes back, you saw the butts of jokes on Saturday Night Live be integrated into the program later on. So they would make fun of somebody for so many weeks, and that at the end of it, 6 weeks, somehow
that person will make a cameo.
Yeah, like whether it was President Obama or President Trump or Senator John McCain or
Sarah Palin.
Yeah, Mark Wahlberg too. I think was he was the subject of a skit from Andy Samberg, and then I knew that he was going to show up, and I think I say that it's cynical because rather than they're showing up with something to plug, but then there's this meta commentary or there's this meta narrative that exists that, oh, they shouldn't be doing this. They're on a scripted show and they weren't initially meant to. They in the outside world is poking in, and I've always felt that that's cheapened narratives, and I also, not that Saturday Night Live is a narrative per se, but at the expense of crafting a quality show and making each sketch its best, you have to say, well, what is going to replay well on Twitter? What's going to turn into a GIF that people are going to use on Tumblr or in their text messages? What's going to become the next memeable sort of in entertainment? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think I agree with you kind of there, especially when it does come to something like Netflix. I do think Netflix almost produces content that's already comes prepackaged to be memed. I think Disney does this almost twicefold. You know, all the Baby Yoda stuff, I believe from the get-go, was like a cynical marketing ploy. And it was like, we have a new Star Wars show. How can we, sell a lot of merchandise real quick? And what will immediately get people talking on social media. And then Netflix, I think Netflix will put up about like 40 GIFs of a movie they just dropped on Netflix that day, because they want people on Twitter, people on Instagram to be already able to put in like the name of the movie and be able to reference it. And then people are like, oh, what's that GIF from?
Right.
You know, something like that. I do find sometimes, you know, in a case of, say, something like Tiger King, it kind of comes pre-packaged to be memed. And then I find we almost have a weird sort of, I don't know how to phrase it. It's almost like Netflix wants to meme something that they don't know how to sell otherwise, or that might not lend itself to, but strains themselves to. And I think about this in the case of last year, the Noah Baumbach film Marriage Story came out on Netflix. Which, if you watch that film, I don't know if you saw it or not.
I've seen parts of it, but I think I know where you're going, is Adam Driver, the accusatory finger posing, and how that was, it was commodified and sort of inserted into the zeitgeist artificially, as opposed to emerging organically. So
yeah, and it almost, it's one of these things where I almost wonder if it is kind of part of the selling your soul aspect of making a film for Netflix, because I think if you were to watch that film long before the memes started, or if you were to ask Noah Baumbach, I don't think you could say Noah Baumbach made or wrote that scene ever with the intention of like, how can I get this memed?
Right.
Like, he made something very pure and meaningful to him, and then you have like Netflix being like, how can we sell this, or what'll get people's attention? And
it's a tough thing to do, but you would hope that the distillation of the movie, or what people take away from it, is that it's a young marriage that falls apart and it's tragic that they can't reconcile, but maybe they just find they refine the humanity in each other. Maybe they're better apart, that sort of thing, as opposed to he went on a tirade and he accused he wished his wife death. And now, because the same individual was in a movie called Star Wars, we can posit him against Baby Yoda and have them artificially interacting. And it's fascinating because it happens so quickly in real real time that you have the people marketing these movies they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. They have to find interesting ways and salient ways to get people to watch these movies and consume this content, while at the same time, well, I don't want to say at the same time, maybe they don't care whether or not people people take the main thesis statement of a film away. Maybe that's not for the marketing department.
Yeah. I mean, so it's different here, because I don't want to sound also like I'm rallying on Netflix, because of when it does come to studios, for the most part, I actually have more respect for Netflix than I do some other studios out there, mainly Disney. I really hate Disney, but I do think I sort of lost my point there.
Well, you were saying that you don't want to accuse the marketers of being so obvious.
Yeah, so I think what the object with Netflix is, if I'm thinking it from an industry standpoint, and necessarily whether or not they care if audiences get the message or the moral of the film, I think what Netflix is sort of on a intent or mission to do right now is that I think what you see coming up, if you look at the film industry more sort of broadly and more galaxy brain, is that what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years is you have a war right now just for content. All of these studios, whether it's Disney forming Disney Plus, Warner Brothers with HBO Max, you have NBC Universal forming the Peacock, you have every major studio essentially taking their entire catalog of film and putting it to one app. And this is in the hopes that going forward, they'll be able to control sort of, hope to get subscribers, but also be able to use this as a platform for distribution, being able to use this as something that people see essential and will want to subscribe to monthly. And so Netflix finds itself basically in a space where, especially coming forward with all these studios now having their own platforms, they don't really have pre-existing content before that's their own, maybe 2009, 2010. So they're on a mission right now, I think, to just sort of bankroll as much content to great filmmakers, to completely average filmmakers, just bankroll a diversity of content so they can form as big a library as they can before they no longer are able to get access to any of the films that are on their platform right now.
Now, all of that being said, do you feel like perhaps like the age of the novel, maybe the age of a feature-length film is coming to an end? I mean, we're talking about this during the launch of Quibi, which is something that for people who don't know, Quibi is short-form content that's made for your mobile devices, and I don't believe any content exceeds 10 or 15 minutes, something like that. So you had a relaunch of the prank show Punk'd, and I think that there is some serialized storytelling with like Sophie Turner and one of the Hemsworth brothers. And do you feel like maybe the age of feature-length filmmaking is gone? Because my wife and I had this conversation just the other day. Tiger King and this global pandemic quarantine was kind of like a perfect storm. It was, for people who don't know, Netflix, it operates largely in the red. They have a lot of outstanding debt, and I think part of this is because as a newer company, they greenlit a lot of expensive productions and to differing audiences. So when you have something like Tiger King that doesn't have high overhead cost and really does well, you get 8 episodes out of it, and you had a very small production expense. Are they willing to, well, maybe this is a bad example, like Beasts of No Nation, are they willing to, even though it's a movie with high accolades based on an acclaimed novel, are they willing to bankroll something for $80 million when $2 million budget is going to get them the streaming numbers they need? Especially, as you said, the climate is changed.
A battle for content.
Yeah, a battle for content about among, let's face it, like 4, possibly 5 conglomerates.
Yeah, so I mean, the simple answer to that is yes, I do think they will continue to bankroll higher budget projects. At this time, there's not been anything that I've seen. In fact,
Netflix kind of outspends most of the major studios on the films they do produce. I think what you're going to see is something like Quibi. I mean, it's so early, it's kind of a wait and see right now. But I don't feel like that's going to be sort of the future of entertainment. What I do think is happening to film, though, when you talk about the changing landscape of feature films, to me, almost, I think less of necessarily Quibi or Netflix, but I think of the MCU and of Game of Thrones. And I do think what we're seeing now is a blurring of the lines between television and film. Because if you look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there is little on paper to separate that from what a television show is. These are sort of a continuing narrative over 23, 24 films. The whole reason a television series is called a series is because it's a series. You know, this is essentially a television series that's formatted for the big screen. And then you look at something like Game of Thrones. The last season, the average episode was about 90 minutes, some were 2 hours. These are narrative-length television episodes that had just as sort of much sort of social investment and attention as something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe when it was coming out. And I think also with the distribution platform changing, with people increasingly watching things at home, I do think we're going to get to a point where the line between sort of what defines a narrative film and what defines a television series is almost invisible. Like it's already sort of bleeding so much together, and I see that kind of continuing. And I mean that for me kind of concerns me, because of I do sort of like the idea of, you know, a standalone story that doesn't have to be part of a pre-existing property.
Sure, and I'll maybe not push back, but I'll ask you, because it is germane to the conversation. You have, well, we'll just talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm a comic book fan, and I'm a comic book fan from really where a lot of these storylines have been pulled from, like the early 90s. The Infinity Gauntlet was really the time that I was reading late 80s, early 90s comic books. There was sort of resurgence there. And I think comic books and the episodic nature of them lend themselves to what the Marvel Cinematic Universe has done. And I see other sorts of storytelling, I guess properties, like Star Wars is the one that comes to mind, trying to emulate this. And Star Wars has always been, to my mind, a morality tale. And I'm not a fan of the extended universe. These are, Star Wars is a morality tale that trades on tropes that are found in Western canon of literature and oral traditions and the Judeo-Christian belief system. And I think that's why Star Wars, which was a golden goose, is not really seeing the same success as Marvel. But going back to my original point, we're going to see a blurring of the lines now that Disney Plus is rolling out television shows with cinematic characters, and which presupposes you're going to have to watch these television shows to fully appreciate what you see in the cinemas. And at what point do let's suppose that I think Scarlet Witch has a series coming out. Let's suppose that this is a hit. Let's suppose that this is the new Stranger Things and everybody loves it. At what point does your television show sink your cinematic endeavors? Because we saw that a little bit with The Mandalorian and Star Wars. Mandalorian was trending so highly, just in terms of zeitgeist and what people thought was quality. I enjoyed The Mandalorian. I thought, truth be told, it's not a very good TV show. I think that it paints with broad strokes and does some things good, but it's not high entertainment. wins any awards. It should be maybe for technical achievement, if anything.
Right.
But at the same time that their full-length feature, The Rise of Skywalker, was getting panned and just torn apart. Like,
yeah, we both despised it.
Well, I mean, it's. I don't think it's a good film, but I mean, broadly, it was an interesting time to have the number one web television show in the world as part of the same property as a middling film. It's.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question almost is less if your television show is going to sink your film so much as at what point,
I guess, is.
Yeah, well, even that, I think it's less going to be like at what point does the television show outperform the film, and I think soon you're going to see at what point does it become more cost effective to release your film on your digital streaming platform than release it in theaters. You know, something like Disney, where they are a sort of a new distributor, and they're one of the biggest, most powerful companies in entertainment. But you are competing, at least on the digital front, against something like Netflix, which already has a healthy head start.
Netflix, Amazon, yeah.
Right. So the question almost becomes, with sort of theater attendances increasingly dwindling, is it more effective for you to tell your consumers, hey, you've already been enjoying, Scarlet Witch this season, coming blah, 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 you can watch this film on our platform as well. If you're not a subscriber of Disney Plus, you're like, oh, well, I got to subscribe to that. And I won't be surprised if soon these streaming memberships become almost sort of like a gym membership, in the sense that you're not paying monthly anymore and that you are tied to that, like, I'm going to pay, $120 or $130 a year or whatever it is, so that I get a year of streaming. And if Disney can be like to you, hey, you're going to get day of release, Black Widow, The Eternals, the next Black Panther movie, and this is the only place where you'll be able to watch them, I think you're going to have a lot of people sort of overnight even be like, okay, I need Disney Plus.
Right. Or, preferential consumption. So I think for Disney Plus, for people who don't know, D23 is a convention that allows it allows a peek, I think, into the upcoming Disney, Star Wars, and Marvel, among many other Pixar too, I think, upcoming releases and that sort of thing. Maybe even something on their tech side too, like video games or whatever. I'm pretty sure that Disney Plus is now streaming it for their subscribers, which is before you would have had to have bought a ticket in order to go there, and then ultimately it would filter through their regular media channels. But what you're saying is you can watch Black Panther 2 a full week, 2 weeks or whatever before the theater crowd can, and I think it will go in that way, and I think it's going to fundamentally change the cosmology of consumption, like video consumption, or not just video, but largely just media.
Yeah, and I think this will be a gradual process. In fact, kind of one of my fears that I've sort of articulated on social media about what's going to happen is I definitely don't think this is going to happen overnight with what Disney is doing. But I think that's going to create a sort of weird effect when we're out of all this, because I pointed out that when movie theaters are finally able to reopen, from everything we've seen, they're going to be essentially operating at 50% of vacancy, occupancy, whatever you want to say. But only half the theaters are going to be able to be full because of social distancing. And if you think about when one of these event films came out, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Marvel, you would think if you go to an 18 theater stadium, about 6 of those movies, 6 of those screens, 7 of those screens are just Star Wars or Avengers.
Right.
If they're doing that at 50% to break even and make the same kind of money they were going to on that movie before social distancing, that's now going to change to 12 theaters, 13 theaters, 14 theaters, which means you'll go to a multiplex and there's maybe 3 movies showing. And I worry about where there is going to be a home for original films. You know, and to me that's really depressing because of not only are those sort of the movies I more gravitate towards, but if you look back on 2019 too, it was sort of a year where original films did sort of better than you would expect them to. Not necessarily, like if you go through the top 10, it's almost still going to be all pre-existing properties. But you had something like Jordan Peele's Us came out last year, and it was the highest grossing horror, or second highest grossing horror film of all time. You had something like Rian Johnson's Knives Out, which was made for a budget of $38 million, and it went on to make over $200 million, and that was just domestically.
Right.
You know, films like Ford versus Ferrari did extremely well. You had Little Women made well over $150 million. You had a lot of well, I guess that's a pre-existing property too, but it's not like
but it's an adaptation
franchise.
It's a fresh adaptation, like the Coen Brothers' True Grit, you know.
Exactly.
So do you feel like, and we can wade as far into this as we want. I think neither one of us are economists. I don't know your full back history, but
no economy in my background.
But a critique of late capitalism, in my estimation, would be that you further degrade the free market with something like this quarantine. The quarantine further degrades it, because afterwards the only people who will be able to survive are major studios that put out this content, and the work becomes more derivative because you have to make a Spider-Man 3, 4, 5, and you've got to reboot it if it doesn't do well, and we get Batman, you know, the next reboot, and all of these things, and they're going to have to take up more theater space, and in order for these things to be fiscally solvent. So I was just thinking while we were talking about the rule that says that studios cannot operate theater chains, and if this would be a way around it. But to my mind, even that solution means that only major conglomerates would be able to bankroll their theaters, so they would outperform the mom and pop shops, and it just doesn't look good to me. So I mean, digital filmmaking and digital release seems to be the lead to the democratization, but also this consolidation too.
So I mean, there's a lot you just said there, and a lot of it is sort of what my concerns are about the film industry in general. I did want to touch on one of those, though, real quick, because of it's something that actually changed. You know, you mentioned that theaters are not able to, or studios are not able to own theaters. And that actually is something that, in sort of what my many issues with the Disney company has been over the last recent years, is one of the reasons for that was because Disney was one of the companies that lobbied against that. They're called the Paramount Decrees, which is that a studio can't own a theater, and that was overturned last year. So now studios actually do have the jurisdiction to go ahead and buy a theater if they want. And, you know, to a certain degree...
Well, sorry, for my own ignorance, why and when did Disney lobby against it, and for what reason?
So for what reason? That, I mean, I couldn't.
Was it possibly because they were low? They were a smaller studio at the time, and they were going to be out.
Oh no! So I mean, this was recently that they lobbied against it.
Oh.
The Paramount Decrees only got overturned last year. This was news that came out about October or November of last year, and a lot of this has been increasingly kind of Disney has been trying to take over the market share of pretty much every theater, major theater chain out there. It's part of the reason why they're swallowing other studios like 20th Century Fox, why they are becoming this increasing monopoly.
Because they use their features to exert proprietary control. So if you want to show the latest Star Wars or the latest Avengers, you have to give us a 3-week window where you are exclusively doing that. And for a small theater that has one projector or at most 3 projectors, Disney lords over them.
Yeah, no. So you actually absolutely nailed it there. It's one of my big issues with Disney is that it's not even just necessarily that if you want to show Star Wars, if you want to show Avengers, it's that if you want to show anything they own, you need to guarantee that you're also going to screen their big ticket releases. So if you are an art house cinema that wants to show something like Jojo Rabbit, which they own because Disney owns Fox Searchlight. Mm-hmm. You cannot show Jojo Rabbit in November without also promising you're going to play 3 weeks of Avengers Infinity War, 3 weeks of Star Wars Rise of Skywalker. They've also been stamping down on the revival cinema, which anything now that Disney or Fox, because of they own Fox, owns in their back catalog, they've turned away revival cinemas from showing their past catalog because of, again, they are not interested in those films being screened unless their new big features are being screened. So if they can buy these theaters outright and they don't have to compete for screen space at a cinema, then they're not worried about the other movies being released. Inevitably coming up soon is the new Batman film, which, has a lot of hype and attention around it. And if you are Disney and say you just released your new Pixar film 2 weeks prior and you're concerned about the new Batman film, if you own a quarter of the theaters in the country and aren't going to be screening the Batman film, you don't have to worry about that competing at the box office with you. And, you can definitely raise the concern of monopoly, but at this point, I already think that Disney would have or should have been considered a monopoly. They own 33% of the entire film industry.
Yeah, well, then that's nothing to speak of their streaming. They're a majority shareholder of Hulu as well, which is basically a satellite of Disney. They own majority shares in most cable networks too. If people didn't know, like History Channel, A&E,
ESPN.
Oh well, yeah, ESPN and ABC. ABC is like what I like to call the news, brought to you by the wonderful world of Disney.
Yeah, 100%. And there's even kind of sort of a worry about the future of even what's going to happen with the Academy Awards, because obviously the network that owns the television rights to that is ABC, and Disney was apparently, people might have followed the news a couple years ago that there was news that the Oscars might try out a Best Popular Film award,
right?
And there was such sort of huge backlash to that idea that they immediately abandoned it. But from what I've read in the trade papers, Variety and Deadline, it seems that, again, that was something that was sort of Disney sort of elbowing their way in, being like, hey, guys, I didn't see, where was Avengers Infinity War last Oscars? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm nervous about what film's going to look like post-coronavirus because of, another thing, too, that's been really great in recent years is you have had independent studios really, really recently make sort of up some ground in the multiplexes. Like A24, for example, is this major independent studio, and they only started in, I believe, 2011, 2012. But now almost every time they release a new film, it plays in multiplexes, whether it's Lady Bird, Midsommar, Hereditary, Uncut Gems. And they have sort of really found this big cult audience, especially of people in their sort of 20s and early 30s. I mean, A24 like releases like merch the way Supreme does, and people will spend like hundreds on A24 merch just because of that. That has become a brand. And in a lot of ways, that's something where it is cynical, but it's like for something that is really giving filmmakers sort of almost total creative freedom and really just like allowing them to push boundaries and releasing that out there. Like, the hell, if you want to release a jacket with your logo on it, I'm cool. Like, I'm not going to bother you about that.
No, that's interesting, because I think about this. You do have the democratization of the filmmaking process. You know, you and I are recording audio for a video that's going to go on YouTube, and it's going to be disseminated to whatever audience wishes to find it. But supposing you and I wanted to make a feature-length film and put it on a platform, well, YouTube, they vacillate between whether they're actually a publisher or they're a platform. This is something that keeps coming up, and you see in their World Health Organization coverage that they don't want anything running contrary to what the WHO puts out, which to me is insane, because the WHO, I think, has been deficient and derelict in some of their prognostications and their warnings to people. I won't delve too far into that. But when you have a tech company or anything that is the arbiter of who is going to see your film, you're going to be locked out. So I wonder if there is any future for film that is independent of the technocracy. I see people have uploaded feature-length films to Vimeo, and right. I mean, whether or not that's going to gain traction, it seems to me that it's no longer you're going to have to be a really sufficient independent filmmaker. You're going to have some sort of savvy if you want to navigate away from Disney or Paramount or WB or Universal.
Yeah, and you know what I think in a lot of ways what you're saying there is kind of people make what might be kind of a lazy comparison, but I think it's a valid one none the same, about the changes that the music industry had to go through in the 21st century. And when you look at like the advent of Spotify, it became less now that recording artists really make their living off the albums they sell. They make it off things like touring and merchandise.
Which the bottom has fallen out of right now.
Exactly, 100%. And I think to that same principle, I do think there is going to have to kind of be something where filmmakers do have to kind of almost become increasingly savvy on how they make their film outside the film itself. And it might be things like, I mentioned A24 makes this kind of sort of hype beast type merchandise, where it might be, you put your film out for $1.99 or $2.99, hoping that a lower price point will get people to watch it, and then you sell like a $50 long sleeve T-shirt to the like cult of fans you formed for it. I wonder what's going to happen. I am scared sort of for the future of cinema. Right now, at least independent cinema. I do think it's not out of the realm of possibility that, sadly, like I can see maybe the single saving grace, at least in the short term, but I don't see working out in the long term, is just those filmmakers working with another giant conglomerate like Netflix in terms of being able to execute their artistic vision. But in terms of being able to actually produce independent films, I really don't know where I see the future for it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because when you're talking about A24, they have to sell something outside of the film just to make these things solvent. And anytime you're you're supposed to be in one business and then you dip your toe into another, it creates a competition for priorities, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it becomes the same question that we went back to initially about, with Netflix or Disney and the memification of their films. How much of a concern is merchandising going to be when A24 is greenlighting films? If I can't make a really cool looking sort of long sleeve tee, do we want to greenlight this movie?
Yeah, how many Leica productions are going to exist without the cute toys that can tie in? Because as far as I know, they make children's features, but they don't commodify or really merchandise their characters, which I appreciate and I get, but it's got to be the exception to the rule for children's films.
Almost certainly, yeah. And it's why I think you see those films almost become sort of like almost at least culturally sort of an afterthought. You had something like Missing Link, which came out last year,
mm-hmm.
and sort of came and went with no real attention. And I do think that is because of children. There's not like 10 action figures of the Sasquatch from that movie when they go to Toys R Us.
They're the anti-Minions.
Yeah, exactly. And so it doesn't have that same sort of cultural prevalence that something like Minions does, where you see the fucking Minions everywhere you go. I am really concerned. My one hope right now, at least again in the short term for independent cinema, is that you do have with art house theaters a system that I really respect that's popped up, that indie distributors Kino Lorber and Magnolia Pictures have done, where a lot of theaters are sort of being left in the dust right now. And what they're doing is the movies that these two distributors were going to release into theaters around now, they are making available on video on demand, but they're selling the ticket to watch it through art house theaters. So essentially, you go to the website of the art house theater, you buy a virtual ticket like you would to see the movie, and then they cut the profits on it the same way they would with an actual ticket sale if you were to see it inside the theater.
And this is something that they don't have to do. This is something they do for the health of the cinema culture, I guess. It's basically like underwriting the cinema culture. And I don't want to cut you off too much, but I'd like to go a little bit more broad with this, because I graduated with a degree in anthropology, so I am interested in the culture. Do you think that we're seeing a cultural sea change in the way people see film, like as it relates to their lives, how they interact with it? Because you're probably 6-7 years younger than I am, and you have some familiarity going to the video store, but you certainly went to the theater more than I did. If you were going every week, I didn't go quite that often, but maybe 10 times a year or something. And but when I was a kid, you would go to the video store and then you would pick out things that you hadn't seen before, or you would just say, "Oh, I'll take a chance on this," or somebody had said something. Are we going to see an erasure of culture? Are people going to become a little bit more disconnected from that, in the same way that people don't go home? Well, maybe I'm talking to the wrong person, and put on a vinyl record, you know what I mean, and sit down and listen to.
I got a few to the side, so maybe the wrong person, but I know what you mean. So I mean, I think I'm in an interesting spot where I'm a little bit younger than you, but I also don't think I'm part of really the generation that's coming up that I see really a huge difference with in terms of how they consume film. I do think there's been a massive change. I do think you do have sort of a generation now that has grown up. I mean, Netflix streaming started, maybe 10 years ago, a little bit longer almost?
Yeah, and for people who are very young, Netflix used to come in your mail.
And
And I do think now you have a whole generation who has grown up just streaming film. That's been the way they consume movies.
Yeah.
And not only that, but they even get used to the idea that they can turn on Netflix, maybe every week, every other week, and there's going to be new content there.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, that is sort of, I would imagine, the same kind of rush that we grew up with, on a Tuesday when Blockbuster would have new VHS tapes ready, or when Friday came around still to these days and a new movie comes out in theaters. I do think for a generation that's coming of age, you have Netflix being their primary distributor of film, and they don't place as much sort of emphasis or interest on film in theaters. And I do think also the way you consume movies, again, at home is not the same way you do in a theater. It is sort of far more casual. I don't think you are as concerned in giving it your full attention.
Sure.
I do think to a certain degree, a lot of it does become background noise. And when I mentioned the sort of almost algorithmic way that Netflix designs their new movies to sort of capture your attention every second, I almost think it's because of that. They're not trying to make you watch the whole movie. What they want to do is provide enough moments of sparks of interest for you that you maybe look away at your phone and then look at it for 2 minutes, and then you see something else happen on your screen and you look at that for a couple minutes and then you go back. But I don't think people are investing in the film the same way they used to.
Yeah. It goes back to my question I had for you is, because of where we're at technologically, because of where we're at culturally, is it possible that, if not the creation of a feature-length film, if that time period isn't over, the holistic consumption of it is largely over? And I'm throwing my wife under the bus here, but we were watching Ms. America, which I think is a joint FX and Hulu production.
Yeah.
And it seems to me it's a series that's set in the 60s during women's liberation and talking about the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, something that I'm not entirely familiar with, but my wife walking in and out of the kitchen without even hitting pause and just trying to catch as catch can. And my wife is younger than I am, and it seems entirely alien to me. Like, how are you going to understand what happens? How are you going to understand?
No, I get that too. And even when because I love showing people movies, and the kind of just, and maybe it's just because I am who I am, and I do, consider myself a film critic, and I do feel like every moment of that is vital. But I do have that sort of same kind of shock. I'll have friends over watch movies, and they'll be like, I have to run to the bathroom, or they'll just get up to go to the bathroom, and I'll be like, yo, do you want me to pause it for you? Like, I'll rewind it, and they're like, nah, keep going. And I'm like, and just in me being me, I can't not pause it. Like, I'm just like, all right, well, I don't care what they said, I'm pausing it. Yeah. But I do think it is that sort of like every moment is not vital. I do not need to understand every second of this to say I watched it. And it's almost just kind of like, yeah, I think that's also, it's part of both viewing habits. It's also part of the way things are being made now as well. And I also think even, and I don't want to say this is the only reason, because I think whatever kind of response you have to a movie is the response you have to it. But it's almost kind of like the hilarious sort of response that like The Irishman got last year when it premiered on Netflix. Because of whether you really loved that film or really didn't like that film, I do think part of the backlash to the film, even more so than maybe issues people had with Marty and stuff he said about Marvel, was just simply, this is a movie, a 3.5-hour movie premiering on Netflix, where it is not providing you something every second to like spark your interest. This is a very like meditative, slow flat film.
Yeah.
That like, it's almost like part of the reason I loved it so much was almost spending 3 hours with it and not even being sure I liked it or not. And then when the last half hour comes, it's sort of like the full weight and culmination of all the moments you just watched preceding it sort of feel like they've built to something that when you get to the final half hour, and I don't want to spoil anything for people who haven't watched the movie, when you realize what the film's starting to trying to do with that, it really makes it powerful. It really sort of like gut punches you. Mm-hmm. And you realize why you invested that amount of time. But if you're tuning in and you're the type of person who wants to watch Tiger King or Spencer Confidential,
right,
and you've just watched an hour and 40 minutes go by, you're halfway through this movie and you still have no idea where the hell it's going, and you've maybe seen one violent shootout, you're kind of like, this movie sucks, man. Let's put on Spencer.
Yeah, you're a DJ after a fashion, and do you feel that this sort of curation is just incumbent upon your personality? Like, specifically with music, do you feel like curating music is...
Yes.
You do? Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, in sort of regards to that, like, there's a very different kind of thrill I get from DJing than I get from sort of doing film criticism. And I do find sort of film criticism still more rewarding because it's something I grew up always kind of wanting to do ever since those days of watching Siskel and Ebert. But yeah, it's that kind of just vibe of like, I love finding something I really like, and then I immediately want to share that with everybody I know. And I kind of just want to be like, yo, look at this thing I found and how great it is. Check it out. I want to share this with you. And those are some of my favorite moments DJing. You know, when I DJ, I really like any kind of reaction I get from a crowd, but it's almost those moments where a song goes better than I expect it to that are the moments I find most rewarding. Like if I play The Killer's Mr. Brightside and people start singing along, I'm not surprised that it's Mr. Brightside. It's like, it's huge. But I remember, because there was a while too before I came home back to Buffalo here while I was still living in England, where we would have resident DJs at the bar I worked at in Manchester. And a lot of times too, what they would do on a Friday, Saturday night, if they couldn't get anyone, is they'd let me just guest DJ. Because they already had the equipment sort of in the basement. They were like, he'd done it before. And I remember there was a night where I played what is it? Get Free by the Vines, which was like a big song for like 1 year,
yeah,
but not really after that. But like a whole like third of the bar, just these guys started like jumping up and down, singing along to like every word, and I found that like the most like rewarding moment of the whole night. Like, but yeah, too, I like throwing in stuff people don't know. You know, like. Sometimes people come up between like a couple songs and be like, "Hey, what was that last song?" And that's some of the best stuff too.
Yeah, you're allowing yourself to pull from the same cultural well as your listeners. So in terms of the Vines, it's like this was a band that hit at the same time as the Strokes and the White Stripes. But they didn't quite endure the same way. But when you maybe put, let's say, a deep cut or an album side from a band that somebody might know, and then they inquire, you're serving as educator in that capacity, and I have to imagine that's rewarding because you're trading in that parlance. You're sort of speaking a universal language.
Yeah, and sometimes too, because of. Lately, most of my DJing has been at Good Bar, and a lot of times the crowd that we get there is a college crowd. So what's really cool, too, sometimes is this admittedly makes me feel really old, but the people are sometimes 21, 22 there. And I can pull a song from, like, 1999, 1998, and this is around the time they were born. and if I can link that to something that's modern that they know, people come up to me and be like, "What was that song?" And I'm like, "Oh, you know, that's Blur, Country House."
Yeah, that's funny. I was just thinking about modern life is Is that what it is? Modern Life is Rubbish?
Yeah. But it's fun finding that link, too, because a lot of people who are 21, 22, they love Gorillaz. They grew up with Gorillaz.
Yeah.
But they are completely oblivious or unaware to, like, Blur's entire catalog.
You mean Paul McCartney was in a band?
He's not just the guy from Wings.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's fun sort of finding those links, or there's so much of like early 2010s indie music that like relies so heavily on the sounds of the 80s that being able to sort of actually go back to some of those sort of like new wave or synth pop songs from the early 80s and play them to a crowd that don't know them, that's really cool. There's been a really huge resurgence, obviously, in like the last 5 years of like sort of very lo-fi rock stuff. Something like, you know, Pavement or Guided by Voices or something like that. Like, again, it's sort of finding a link to Dinosaur Jr. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Finding that stuff that has a link to the modern too.
Yeah. Right. You're able to contextualize it. I DJ once a week, or excuse me, I DJ once a year.
A little bit different.
Right, exactly. Yeah, only by a factor of 50. I DJ the 80s party for Feed More Western New York, and I love it, but it's different because it is confined entirely to one decade. Whereas you, if you wish to play something by, let's say, The Sounds, then you can contextualize it by playing something by, I don't know, Roxette, if you want.
Yeah.
So and it's a little bit, it's maybe a little bit more artistically fulfilling as opposed to where I get to nostalgia trip, and I mean maybe it's what you make it, but I think that speaking that language works.
Yeah, and I mean even to that degree. Even when you confine it to an era, it's being able to slip in sort of, again, if I was to do a 2000s indie rock night, you know, still the heavy hitters of that would have been The Strokes, would have been Arctic Monkeys, would have been Interpol, White Stripes. Mm-hmm. Throwing in a Vine songs like that, it might still be a little bit bigger of a hit, but it's still like something that a lot of people just might not know, or might have completely forgotten about. Yeah. And so it's that thing of even if you sort of narrow the parameters of what you're allowed to play, there is sort of still an excitement to being able to find the places you can get weird with it, or maybe the places you're really passionate about that particular genre,
right?
That you get to share with people. You know, like we've done really sort of narrow parameter nights before. We had an entire night where we just played music from Quentin Tarantino movies.
Oh, interesting. Now, movies that he's also starred in too. So would From Dawn to Dusk?
We included From Dusk to Dawn, yeah.
Yeah, Dusk Till Dawn, right? Or what was the other one? True Romance.
True Romance. I thought about including the Golden Girls because that's where he debuted. He debuted as an Elvis impersonator on the Golden Girls.
Oh, that's funny.
So I almost thought of just throwing in the Golden Girls theme, but I didn't get around to that.
Yeah, no. Like, if you have to give yourself these parameters in order to really stretch your abilities to really kind of hone in on what it is you're doing, to be deliberate and thoughtful about these things. I think that, well, again, just taking this back to our 80s party we did the entire party without playing any Michael Jackson, and it wasn't a choice of mine. It was a choice of my co-DJ that he didn't want to play it, Michael Jackson. But it just slipped my mind. I played Juice Newton before I played Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know who Juice Newton is like a country pop singer from like the 80s. And, so whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny you mention that because we had a sort of similar experience again where for us it was kind of a very conscious choice, but we did a Halloween party, and it's really hard to do a Halloween party and not play Thriller.
I thought it was legally
exactly. But we managed to get through the whole night without playing Thriller. It allowed us to be a little bit more creative. And I think only like maybe one or two people came up, and I was just like, "Yo, we don't do that."
Sorry, we're fresh out.
One person complained about it. The other person, I almost felt bad because it was almost like you could see like they had been drinking and it almost like was like they realized it in real time. Like we were like, sorry, dude, we just can't do that because then he's like, oh fuck, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, and then he like walked away. Almost like I wanted to go over and be like, dude, I didn't want to make you feel like a jerk, but
yeah.
But it's funny watching sort of the social exchange of that. But yeah, I actually find a lot of too, just having the ability to play whatever too is kind of fun too, because of even across sort of maybe decades, it's fun to sort of play with genre too. Mm-hmm. So like one of the things that I really like to do, I probably do this in one of my mixes at least once a month, is there's a really famous Vampire Weekend song called Step.
Is it on the second album?
Third. But because we are primarily still doing an indie night, people primarily come out for indie music, but we play a wide variety of stuff. And because Vampire Weekend is a band like Vampire Weekend, like they're just like white rock dudes playing instruments, people don't sort of think of them as having like sampled or any other artist. And actually that song sort of interpolates the chorus from a 90s hip-hop song by Souls of Mischief called Step to My Girl. So a lot of time, and it literally is the same melody, same chorus. And so what I love...
sorry, just to interject, one of the few times that rock bands sample hip-hop artists.
Exactly.
Okay, continue.
And so I love to sort of, start playing the Vampire Weekend song, and then I can very easily sort of sample that chorus and just keep sort of plugging it in until I can put the Souls of Mischief song in. Yeah. And it's kind of one of those things where it's one of those moments of curation where you kind of are being a musical sort of educator, because people can hear even the aesthetic on that Souls of Mischief song, and they're like, oh, this is not a new song. This sounds, 1991, 1992, right. Like this is early hip hop. And people have come up after I've done that and be like, yo, what's that song? And it's moments like that make it really exciting. But yeah, it is kind of that same rush of being able to just share the things you're really passionate about. That I guess I do with film criticism and especially the podcast.
Well, you get to exercise or demonstrate maybe a knowledge of that compendium, so that you're basically expressing your knowledge of those works, that substrate on which some of these newer songs are built on or influenced by. Now, seeing as how you're probably not going to be DJing to a crowd anytime soon, live, I should say, because I think digital dance parties are a thing. Not in my neck of the woods, they're not.
Right. I do want to put one shout out there though, because there is one person doing it who's Jeremy Franklin. He's been doing sort of weekly DJing on Instagram and stuff, and getting 100, 200 viewers on a weekly basis. Okay. So it's bad to like plug him and then completely forget his handle. But
we can look it up after the fact and then throw it up here.
But if you did want to check out some Buffalo-based DJing, definitely check out what he's doing.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put that on. Now what I was getting at is, because everything has been in every sector and way of life is appreciably been affected by the coronavirus and the response, quarantine and shelter-in-place orders. What do you think are some of the results of this? What do you see the fallout being?
So, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting because I know even if you look at some of the guidelines for the gradual sort of reopening of businesses, I think even when bars are finally going to be reopening, it's going to be unlikely that they're immediately going to go to putting on rock shows or having people DJ, because there is almost, I feel like, going to be a conscious effort to continue social distancing for a while. I don't really know going forward for DJing, especially. I don't think it's going to die by any means. I do think we're on kind of a weird pause for it. But, in terms of regularly DJing on a weekly basis, I think that is something where, sadly, it's probably going to just have to take a back seat or a pause for a while. I do think it's cool that people are kind of innovating with things like, these digital dance parties, or I think there's also something to be said in today's age just about curation in general. So, maybe it is something as simple as being able to curate a playlist for people, being able to, I don't really know going forward. It is such a sort of weird time, and it is almost a profession that's sort of like being an artist, a musical artist. It all kind of results or draws on crowd reaction and experience. So it's almost hard to do it without that.
Yeah, it's definitely a communal activity, and I think about this as an illustrator, as a comic artist, is that I produce a commodity that is not valuable, and I don't mean that in a self-deprecating way. I mean in that it is not an essential good that somebody needs to have in their life. It is art is the spice of life. It's not the meat and potatoes, but it's difficult because I wish to make the transition to be a self-employed artist at some point, but you have to wonder, how do you commodify something that can immediately evaporate? And I think about people who are in good positions, touring musicians and gigging musicians. How do they weather the storm, and how does the culture weather the storm, and what does it do to our culture? Because I think that this is precisely a moment in time that we do need to be more communal. I mean, you see just politically, ideologically, not just in America, but across the world, people are divided on...
Certainly.
And you would hope that if you could focus on the local or just the immediate things, that you can make the world a better place. But now as it stands, you can't even see the people you care about unless they live in your house. And
right.
I guess I'm kind of at a loss, because some of the things that we typically do, and I don't want to say, and I don't want to be insensitive, but we kind of understand what happens when terrorism occurs, or a mass shooting, or something of those minds. Like, we can go and we can be there for the victims, and we can have a debate whether or not it's robust or fruitful in the wake of it. But here, you cannot be there for the people you want. Bringing somebody, an elderly person, maybe some food, if it's contaminated, could be a death sentence. And I'm unsure of what happens other than more caution, future facing. But what does that do to society?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's weird too, because I do think the social impetus is there of, like, people are so desperate to get back to their normal lives, but at the same time, even when it's going to be a long time before things go back to normal.
If ever.
And the thing is, the structures are going to have to be in place for a while to keep things sort of abnormal, because for our safety. So I mean, things that are communal activities, things like DJing, things like concerts, things even like cinema. It's difficult to see what the future is like that going to be for that immediately. I do think a lot of it is going to have to
as an artist, just find ways to be more creative, to find an outlet for it, and to find an audience through it for it. But when so much of it is built off a communal response, it's difficult. You mentioned people who are sort of touring artists, but like even somebody like myself, by the start of this year, I was making enough DJing that it was my full-time profession, basically. Mm-hmm. I was DJing and going to school, and that was all I was doing. I was making enough DJing that I was able to pay my rent, that I was able to pay my bills. And now for the foreseeable future, like I don't really know how long it's going to be before I'm able to do that again. And
it's
so
tough
it is,
if you it's tough if you like what it is you do and you can make a subsistence living off of it.
Oh, 100%. Because of to age myself, I'm 29. I'm coming up on my 30s right now, and I spent most of my 20s pretty much going through dead end jobs that I did not enjoy. And coming into this year, I was very excited that even if I didn't have what felt like the most stable career, I was really enjoying and was able to make enough doing what I was doing. And I kind of felt in a very comfortable place. I even had offers from a few other venues to regularly DJ there, and was potentially in an even more financially stable situation going forward. And now, who knows?
Right.
And it is that question of like, do I just have to find a completely new profession? Do I have to start over? How long will it be before what I was really enjoying doing will be viable? And yeah, I mean, that's part of, for me, why I went back to school, why I'm studying other fields. But if you really do want to make a living and that's your only field, it's really hard right now. I would love to be able to say something that's optimistic about like something like the future of DJing, but unlike maybe cinema where I can see some bright spots in the future, it's really hard in the short term for me to see a positive for DJing. That might be a year or two out at least.
Well, I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about and so many more avenues we can stroll down. I miss getting together with you and discussing this stuff in person, but I'm going to have to bring this thing in for a landing. Is there anything that you want to promote? I mean, Cynicism or...
Sure. So us as a podcast, we're on a little bit of a hiatus, but we may be coming back in the near-term future. It's cynicismfilm.com. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at cynicismfilm. And we do have our podcast. It's up on Spotify. You can go listen to back episodes now. So if you're looking for something to watch at home on Netflix, on Hulu, go through some of those back episodes, watch that movie, listen to our app, and have a fun little experience.
Well, that sounds like a great suggestion. I might do that. I'm a big fan of the film. I think that you have interesting thoughts on it, and I thank you for your time, Nick. I'll have to have
Thanks,
you back.
Phil.
All right. Bye. And that was my conversation with Nick Muldoon. You can find him on the web at cynicismfilm.com or at Cynicism on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me online at salsciandra.com or at salcomics with an X on Instagram. Join me again next week at 9 p.m. for another Saturday night special. Until then, take care of yourself.